If you have a rental property that was built before 1978, you are required to disclose an environmental hazard to every tenant. Are you doing that? If you don't know what I'm talking about, this video is for you. I'm Jennifer Rowlands, landlord, educator, advocate, and broker at One Focus Property Management. We manage a very large portfolio in North Central Pennsylvania, and one thing that's true about most of the properties that we manage is that they're really old. In fact, the average age of our properties is somewhere between 75 and 100 years old. And so we're very familiar with working with older properties, but sometimes people don't know exactly what it means when we talk about a property being built before 1978 and what's significant about that. Well, prior to 1978, it was very common for lead to be used in paint. Lead did a lot of great things for paint. It made it resistant to corrosion, it made it more durable, and so it was really common to use. However, it's a problem, it's an environmental hazard for the people in that home, particularly children. So the risk exists when lead is ingested into the body. It can cause a lot of terrible things, but things that are commonly seen are behavioral issues, seizures, even death. So there's a lot of complications that can happen. Sometimes people ask me, well, how are people ingesting the paint, especially children? Well, here's what you need to remember. Paint eventually flakes and falls off. And sometimes we even sand it doing a project. And those particles, the flakes, the particles, those are things that can be ingested. So flakes of paint, things like that. Little children are on the floor and they put them in their mouths. One thing I was always taught when I got into this business is that windowsills. So children, when they're the height of a windowsill, might get that high, and when they're teething, they might bite on that windowsill, and that was a common way that the lead would get into people. So we in 1978, the country banned the use of lead-based paint in the marketplace, which is fantastic. But what it didn't do was address all of the lead-based paint that was already used on the buildings in our country. In 1992, our federal government passed the Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. Now, the EPA and HUD are jointly accountable for enforcing this, but basically what that legislation says is anytime a property that was built prior to 1978 is sold or leased, so residential property older than 1978, every time it's sold or leased, a lead-based paint disclosure must be provided to the buyer or to the lessee, the tenant. What is that? Well, let's look at it together. This form is the form that you need to use to provide the required disclosure to a buyer or a tenant. The first thing you're disclosing is whether or not the property is older than 1978. And that's a simple question, yes or no. Now, sometimes when I ask that question of landlords and things, they give me explanation about when things were painted or reasons that they feel like there's no lead-based paint in the property. This question is just a yes or no. Was it built before 1978? Any part of it? And so if you're in my market, that very commonly the answer is yes. I know in some markets, property is quite a bit newer. The second part of this is if the property is older than 1978, the seller or the landlord needs to disclose any specific knowledge or reports of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards on the property. So how would you become aware of some lead-based paint hazards? Well, when you bought the property, were you provided this disclosure, and did it disclose to you any lead-based paint hazards? If so, those would need to go on your form and you would need to disclose it to tenants and future buyers. Another way you might become aware of it is if you hired somebody to do a lead-based paint inspection. So if you hired somebody to come and identify all the lead-based paint that exists on your property and they provided you a report and it indicated that there were some, that report would need to be attached with this disclosure. The third way you could determine if there was lead-based paint on your property is you did a test yourself. So at home building supply stores, you can buy a little lead-based paint kit. It's a little tube with a little swab, and it's really quick results. However, once you've used that and found that there is lead-based paint at the property, you're going to disclose that on that form forevermore. So my approach to lead-based paint is this. One, assume it's there. So on these forms, we're always, of course, informing people truthfully about any knowledge that we specifically have. But it's quite unusual to have specific knowledge, particularly in single-family homes and small multifamily homes. I've seen this done more rigorously on larger multifamily projects, but on small homes, it's really uncommon to have reports or to have tested for that. And then in practice, we always treat paint like it's lead-based. So we're using lead-based paint required standards for fixing and making repairs, which is additional drop cloths, air quality controls, and not using power sanders, things like that. We actually train our team on how to do that safely, so any repairs that we make that disturbs paint won't impact anybody around, regardless of whether or not it has lead in it. And typically, it's best to do that. It doesn't cost much more to do these things properly and safely, as opposed to testing everything to determine if we could do it less expensively. And then having a report we need to provide to people forever in the future. I know you're saying, I've never heard of this. I don't have them on my properties now. Why should I care? You should care because not having it makes you particularly susceptible to a tenant making a complaint against you as a way to get their way. So if you have some sort of disagreement with someone, this is the kind of thing that they'll take their paperwork to an attorney to start to get some advice, and any good attorney is going to look and see, hey, you don't have this, and call it up as an issue with you. So all of a sudden, they have some leverage to get you to do what they want you to do. And why they have that leverage is because EPA and HUD, who enforce this act, are federal agencies. They don't mess around, the fines aren't small, and neither is the process is really, it's really onerous. So my best advice to you is to go through your leases, make sure these are all in check, completely signed and in your files, and if not, do it now. Get those signed, get those in your files, and make it a part of your lease template in the future so you don't ever forget it again. Making these videos is a blast. Please let me know what you think. Give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down if we deserve it, and hopefully you'll subscribe and share with a friend. Until next week.